I thought I was signing a routine mortgage refinancing form. I thought the notary my husband had arranged to come to our home on a Tuesday afternoon was simply there to lower our interest rate, the way Mark had explained it 3 times, in 3 different casual, almost bored tones, the way he explained things he didn't want me to think too hard about. I signed where the little yellow sticky arrows pointed, the way you sign things when you trust the person sitting across from you, the person you married, the person whose coffee cup still had his lipstick pink mouthwash ring on the rim from that morning. I signed and I smiled, and I offered the notary a glass of water. I had no idea that I had just signed away my own home to my mother-in-law's nephew, a man I had met exactly twice, both times at Christmas dinners where he spent the evening staring at his phone. I had no idea that the house I had bought with my own savings, the house I had repainted corner by corner with my own hands, the house that still smelled like the lavender I planted along the front walk, was no longer mine. And I had no idea that my husband had known about it for 6 months. The house on Carver Lane had been mine before Mark. That was the detail that mattered, the detail that Brenda, my mother-in-law, could never quite swallow without a visible tightening around her jaw, a brief, controlled flicker of something that was not quite envy and not quite contempt, but lived somewhere in the narrow corridor between the two. I had bought it at 29, 2 years before I met Mark, with 11 years of careful, relentless saving. The kind of saving that means you eat lunches you packed yourself and you don't replace your winter coat until the lining tears completely through. I had been a junior account manager at a logistics firm then, working hours that left me hollow-eyed and proud. And when I finally sat in that settlement office and signed the actual documents, the ones I had read, the ones I understood, I had felt something shift in my chest that I did not have a name for yet, but later came to understand was the specific and irreplaceable feeling of standing on ground that was entirely your own. It was a narrow Victorian with original crown moldings and a kitchen that needed everything but had good bones and perfect light. The front porch listed slightly to the left, and the 3rd stair from the top always creaked. And I loved both of these things with a fierceness I didn't fully understand until someone tried to take them from me. I had refinished the hardwood floors myself over one long, paint fume-saturated October weekend, kneeling on the wood with a rented sander while my neighbor Mrs. Calloway brought me sandwiches through the side window and told me I was the most stubborn woman she had ever liked. I hung my own curtains. I built the bookshelf in the hallway from a kit that came in 47 pieces and took me 2 evenings and 1 spectacular argument with an Allen wrench. By the time I met Mark at a mutual friend's birthday party, the house on Carver Lane was not just a property, it was a record of who I was. Mark had loved it, or said he did. He had loved the porch especially, said it was the first thing that made him feel like a house could be a home. He was charming and warm, and he made me laugh in the particular way that makes you feel seen. And when we got married 3 years later and he moved in, I genuinely believed we were building something together in the truest sense. 2 people, 1 life, 1 front door key that we hung on a little ceramic hook I'd found at a flea market in the shape of a sparrow. He paid half the mortgage from the day he moved in. He mowed the lawn. He repainted the porch railing that second summer. For a while, it really felt like that. For a while. Brenda had never said anything directly negative about the house. That was her style, to express disapproval through absence and implication, through the fractional pause before she said, "very cozy," when she meant small, through the way she ran 1 finger along the window ledge in the kitchen the first time she visited, and then examined her fingertip without comment. She was a tall woman with careful posture and hair that was always set in the same way, silver-streaked and precise, and she dressed in the kind of neutrals that communicated she had never once in her life been careless. She called me dear in a voice that managed to make the word feel like a category rather than an endearment. She brought casseroles that no one had asked for and rearranged things in my kitchen while I was at work, and when I moved them back, she would tilt her head and say, "Oh, I thought that might be more practical, but you know best, dear." She had asked me once, only once, and early enough that I had not yet learned to listen to her questions the way you listen to a contract, whether my name was the only one on the deed. This was about 8 months after the wedding, on a Sunday afternoon when Mark had gone to get more wine from the basement, and Brenda and I were alone in the kitchen with the sound of the football game bleeding through from the living room. I was cutting apples for a tart, and she was standing by the window, and she asked it the way you ask about the weather, pleasantly, with mild curiosity, as if the answer was of no real consequence. I told her yes, just my name, since I'd bought it before the marriage, and she nodded and looked out the window and said, Smart. And then Mark came back with the wine, and we talked about something else entirely, and I filed the question away in the back of my mind under the label of slightly nosy, which was where I kept most of Brenda. I should have filed it differently. The first real crack appeared the following spring, though I did not recognize it as a crack at the time. Mark had started working from home 2 days a week, which meant he was home when Brenda called, which meant their phone conversations, previously something I experienced only through one-sided reports at dinner, became something I occasionally half overheard from the hallway or the top of the stairs. I did not eavesdrop intentionally. The house was not designed for secrets. It had thin plaster walls and the kind of acoustic quality that meant you could hear a whispered argument from 2 rooms away. What I caught were fragments. She doesn't need to know the details yet. A long pause, and then, Mom, I told you, let me handle the timing. Another time. The thing about refinancing is it's not technically, no, she'd understand it as, look, just let me figure out the paperwork. I heard these things, and I constructed explanations for them that made me feel better. Mark was handling some financial surprise and didn't want to worry me. He was planning something, maybe a renovation, maybe a birthday surprise, though my birthday was 4 months away. He was managing his mother, the way he always managed his mother, and the managing required some low-grade deception that was ultimately harmless. I was good at constructing these explanations. I had years of practice. What I noticed more concretely was the change in him when I brought up the house. Not frequently. I didn't have a habit of discussing property over dinner, but occasionally something would prompt it. A neighbor mentioning their property tax bill, a news story about the housing market, the time I floated the idea of putting in a proper garden bed along the back fence. Each time, Mark developed a kind of vagueness, a change of subject so smooth it didn't feel like deflection until I thought about it later. He started using the phrase, down the road, a great deal. We'll think about the garden down the road. The fence can wait. Let's see what things look like down the road. It was the language of postponement, and at the time I read it as the ordinary low-grade inertia of a person who preferred not to make decisions before he had to. I was wrong. He was not postponing the future. He was managing the countdown to a specific date. I also noticed that Brenda's nephew, Derek, had somehow become a recurring presence in our lives in a way that had not previously been the case. Derek was 34 and lived 40 minutes away and managed, as far as I could tell, to do very little with great confidence. He had appeared at Christmas and Easter for years without making much of an impression on me, beyond a vague sense that he borrowed things without returning them. But that spring he came to dinner twice, and both times Brenda was also there, and there was something slightly formal about the evenings, a quality of arranged occasion that I noticed but could not name. Derek looked at the house differently than a dinner guest looks at a house. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they are calculating. The notary came on a Tuesday in late April. His name was Gerald, and he was efficient and pleasant and set his briefcase on the kitchen table with a practiced, unhurried manner. Mark had explained the refinancing weeks earlier, and I had asked a few questions, interest rate, term length, and received answers that were plausible and boring, and that I had not pressed further, because Mark handled the financial logistics of the household, and I handled the scheduling and the insurance and the taxes, and we had a system that had worked, or seemed to have worked, and I trusted it. I trusted him. I signed 4 documents. I remember that Gerald offered me a pen from his breast pocket, and I used my own instead, because I always use my own pen for important things. A small, automatic habit I could not explain. I signed where the arrows pointed. Mark witnessed, Gerald notarized. We shook hands. I offered water. He declined. And then he left, and Mark went to the living room, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment with the strange, hollow feeling of having done something, though I could not identify what. And then I started making dinner and forgot about it entirely. For 11 days. The discovery did not happen the way I might have imagined it, in some dramatic movie-style confrontation. It happened the way most devastating things happen in real life. Accidentally, sideways, in the middle of an ordinary errand. I had gone to the bank to handle a discrepancy in our joint account, a small matter of a charge I didn't recognize, and the account manager who helped me, a young woman named Priya with reading glasses perched on her head, had pulled up our records and then gone quiet, in the way that bank employees go quiet when they are looking at something that surprises them and are deciding how much to say. "Mrs. Holloway," she said carefully, "I want to make sure I'm understanding your account correctly. Can I ask, are you aware of the property transfer that was recorded against the Carver Lane address 11 days ago?" The room did not spin. That is what people say, but rooms don't spin. What happens is that the world suddenly becomes very still and very loud at the same time. And your own breathing sounds like it is coming from somewhere outside you, and the fluorescent lights above the bank desk seem to sharpen into something almost painful. I asked her to repeat the question. She repeated it. I told her I was not sure what she meant by a property transfer. She typed something. She turned the monitor toward me. The document on the screen was a deed. My name was on it. My full legal name, Sarah Ann Holloway, printed clearly in the property description, but only in the section marked grantor. The grantee, the person to whom the property had been transferred, was listed as Derek Allen Voigt, Brenda's nephew, the man who had come to dinner twice that spring and looked at my house like he was calculating it. The consideration listed was $1. $1. My home of 8 years, the house I had bought with 11 years of savings, the house with the lavender along the front walk and the creaking third stair, and the bookshelf I had built myself, had been legally transferred to Derek Voigt for $1 11 days ago, while I stood in my own kitchen and offered the notary a glass of water. My signature was on the deed. I could see it from across the desk. My handwriting, my signature, in my own ink from my own pen. I sat in that bank chair for what Priya later told me was almost 4 minutes without saying anything. I was aware of the sound of the air conditioning, a low, persistent hum. I was aware of the smell of the bank, that particular institutional neutrality, paper and carpet and faint cleaning solution. I was aware of my own hands on the edge of the desk, fingers pressed flat against the laminate, as if I needed to feel something solid. The signature was mine. The documents were real. The date was 11 days ago. And my husband had been home with me every evening for 11 days, eating dinner, watching television, sleeping in our bed, in a house that he had helped sell out from under me, without ever once, not once, letting it show on his face. I sat in the car for 20 minutes before I could drive. I had walked out of the bank with my spine straight and my face composed, the way you hold yourself together in public when the alternative is coming apart completely on a stranger's floor. And I had reached my car and sat down and gripped the steering wheel and stayed very still while the full enormity of what I now knew settled over me like something physical, a weight, a cold pressure, a kind of density in my chest that made breathing feel like work. The neighborhood outside the windshield continued its ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A woman pushing a stroller, a man loading groceries, a mail truck idling at the corner. The world did not know. The world was carrying on with perfect, indifferent normalcy, while the last 11 years of my life were being quietly reclassified in my mind from marriage to long con. I drove to my father's house. I did not call first. My father, Robert, was 67 and retired and spent his afternoons in his workshop building birdhouses he gave away to neighbors. And when I knocked on the back door, he was standing at his workbench with a square of sandpaper in his hand and sawdust on his flannel shirt. And he took one look at my face and set the sandpaper down. He did not say, "What's wrong?" or "Are you okay?" He pulled out the stool next to the workbench and said, "Sit." And I sat, and I told him. I told him about Priya and the bank and the screen and the deed and the $1 and Derek Voigt and the notary named Gerald with the briefcase and the yellow sticky arrows and the 4 documents and my own pen and my own signature. My father listened without interrupting. His face did not change much. He was a man who had spent 40 years as a civil engineer, and he processed information the way he processed structural problems, quietly and precisely. But I saw his jaw tighten at the part about the $1, and I saw his eyes go still at the part about the 4 documents. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. The workshop smelled of cedar and linseed oil and sawdust. Outside, a sparrow was working at the empty feeder on the back fence. Finally, my father said, "Did you keep a copy of anything you signed?" I told him I hadn't. Gerald had taken all copies with him. My father nodded slowly. Then he said, "I know an attorney. Her name is Deborah Crane. She handles real estate fraud." He said it the way he said everything, calmly, practically. And then he picked up his phone and called her while I sat on the stool and stared at the birdhouse on the workbench that was half finished, one side still open, which seemed at that moment like the most precise possible metaphor for my life. Deborah Crane was in her 50s and had an office that smelled like strong coffee and printer toner and something faintly floral that I later identified as a candle on the windowsill labeled Focus. She was brisk and direct and did not waste energy on expressions of sympathy that would not help me. She asked me to tell her everything from the beginning, and I did, and she took notes in a small leather notebook with a very fine pen. And when I was finished, she said, "The document you signed was almost certainly not a refinancing agreement. Based on what you're describing, a notary brought to your home, 4 documents, your signature as grantor, the grantee being a family-affiliated third party for nominal consideration, this was a deed transfer, either a quitclaim or a warranty deed. The question is whether the documents you signed were fraudulently represented to you, which in your state constitutes deed fraud, which is a felony." She said felony the way other people say Tuesday, matter of fact, informational. And something about that flat delivery made the word more real, not less. She told me to go home. She told me to behave exactly as I normally would. She told me not to confront Mark, not yet, because confrontation without documentation was noise, and noise would only cause the other side to hide things. She told me she would obtain the deed records that afternoon and have them reviewed by morning. She told me to photograph anything I thought might be relevant, financial documents, mail, anything with Derek Voigt's name or Brenda's. She told me to write down every conversation I could remember where Mark had mentioned refinancing, with as much detail and approximate date as I could recall. Then she stood up and shook my hand and walked me to the door, and I felt, for the first time since sitting across from Priya's turned monitor, that I was not standing alone in the middle of an open field. Driving home felt like walking into a theater where I knew the play was a lie but had to perform my role anyway. The house on Carver Lane looked the same from the outside. The lavender along the front walk was just coming into bloom, purple-blue and fragrant, and the porch railing that Mark had repainted 2 summers ago was still crisp white. I unlocked the front door, with the key I still technically had no legal right to use, according to a transfer Mark had helped engineer, and walked into the kitchen. And Mark was there, standing at the counter eating an apple, and he looked up and said, "Hey, how is the bank?" There are moments in your life when you understand that you are a better actor than you ever knew. This was one of them. I said, "Fine, routine stuff." I set my bag down. I turned on the kettle for tea. I moved through the kitchen with my hands and feet and my practiced ordinary face while something in my chest stayed very, very cold and very still. The kind of cold that is not panic, but its opposite. The cold of complete, clarifying purpose. Mark ate his apple and talked about something he had heard on the radio, and I watched him, and I thought, I see you now. I see exactly who you are, and you have no idea that I do, and that is the only advantage I have, and I am going to use it. I used it for 4 days. 4 days of normal dinners and ordinary conversation, and the patient, deliberate collection of everything Deborah Crane had asked me to document. I found the refinancing folder in the filing cabinet in Mark's home office, a folder labeled with the innocuous beige-boring title, Home/Financial, Spring. Inside were copies of the documents I had signed. They were not refinancing agreements. They were, as Deborah had predicted, a quitclaim deed and 3 supplementary transfer documents, all executed and notarized, all bearing my signature. In the folder beneath them was a document I had not seen before, a purchase and sale agreement between Derek Allen Voigt and a property management company called Meridian Holdings, LLC, dated 3 weeks after our signing, for $340,000. My home, which I had bought for $212,000 and which was now worth, according to recent comps, approximately $360,000, had been transferred to Derek for $1, and Derek had contracted to sell it to Meridian Holdings for $340,000, of which his cut, per a separate document, was $40,000, with the remainder going to an account I did not recognize. I photographed every page. My hands were steady. My breath was slow and even. I was past shaking. What I found next was worse. Behind the purchase agreement was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten list in Brenda's sharp, angular handwriting. I recognized it from birthday cards and the passive-aggressive notes she left on casseroles. The list had dates and dollar amounts. My address was at the top. Below it were what appeared to be disbursement notes, amounts divided between 3 parties designated only by initials. B received 40%, D received 20%, M received 40%. M. Mark. Mark was not a passive participant, not a weak man swept along by his mother's current. He had negotiated his cut. He had his own line in Brenda's handwritten register. 40% of $300,000, less expenses, less Derek's cut, was still enough to end a marriage and start a new life somewhere Brenda had presumably already picked out for him. I sat on the floor of his home office for a long time. The list of things I thought I had known, and had in fact never known, was too long to enumerate in that moment. I folded the thought away. I photographed the handwritten sheet. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. Then I went downstairs and made dinner and called Deborah Crane from the bathroom with the fan running, and she listened to my description of the documents and said, quietly and precisely, "Good. That's everything we need." The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening, and it did not happen the way I had imagined it. Not the private, burning conversation between a wife and husband that I had rehearsed during 4 nights of insufficient sleep. It happened in Brenda's living room because Deborah had advised that witnesses were useful and that Brenda's presence at the confrontation would prevent her from coaching Mark's response in the hours after. I had texted Mark that I thought we should have dinner with his mother. I framed it as an olive branch, a gesture of goodwill, and he had agreed with a readiness that told me he felt safe, that he believed he was still in control of the timeline. Brenda opened her door in her usual neutrals, her hair precisely set, and offered us tea with the serene composure of someone who has no reason to be nervous, which, she was about to discover, was no longer an accurate self-assessment. I waited until we were all seated. I waited until the tea was poured. I wanted them comfortable. Comfortable people are slower to construct defenses. Then I set the photographs on the coffee table, printed, time-stamped, organized in a clear plastic sleeve the way Deborah had suggested, and I said, calmly and quietly, "I want to talk about the deed transfer on Carver Lane." The silence that followed was the most instructive few seconds of my marriage. Brenda's face did not collapse. She was too controlled for that. But something shifted behind her eyes, a rapid recalculation, a reassessment of the board. Mark went pale. Not gradually, immediately, as if someone had drained the color from beneath his skin all at once. His teacup made a small sound against the saucer, the tiny tremor of a hand that had suddenly lost its steadiness. Brenda recovered first. Of course she did. "Dear," she said, in that precisely modulated voice that deployed the word like a scalpel, "I think there may be some confusion. The arrangement was entirely legal, and you were fully informed." "I was told I was signing a refinancing agreement," I said. I kept my voice level. I was told that by my husband, multiple times, over several weeks. The documents I actually signed transferred ownership of my home to your nephew for $1. I set the photograph of the quitclaim deed on top of the stack. "I also have the purchase and sale agreement Derek executed 3 weeks later for $340,000. I set that on top. "And I have your handwriting, Brenda, on a disbursement schedule dividing that money among 3 parties. I set that one last, including one marked M for 40%. Brenda looked at the photographs, her chin lifted. "That document is private correspondence and was taken without—" "It was in the filing cabinet in my marital home," I said, "which was my home, which I built with my own savings before I ever met your son." I turned to Mark. He was looking at the table. "Mark?" He didn't move. "Look at me." Slowly, with the expression of a man who has just understood that the ground has dropped away beneath him, he raised his eyes. I looked at him for a long moment, at the face I had woken up next to for 6 years, the face I had trusted and cooked for and planned a future with, and I said quietly, "You knew, from the beginning. You didn't just fail to protect me, you built the plan." His mouth opened. He said nothing. His mother said his name, Mark, in a sharp, warning tone, and he closed his mouth. "I have engaged an attorney," I said, "Deborah Crane. I think you've heard of her, Brenda, because she has successfully prosecuted 2 deed fraud cases in this county in the last 4 years, and her name is on the courthouse wall." I had not planned that line. It came from somewhere cold and precise that I had not previously known was inside me. She filed a complaint with the county recorder's office this afternoon to flag the fraudulent transfer. She has also contacted the district attorney's office regarding potential criminal charges for deed fraud, forgery, and elder financial exploitation statutes as applicable. Derek Voigt's real estate license, which he has had for 14 months, may be of interest to the licensing board. I stood up. "I'm going to need my key back, Mark." He put the key on the table. He didn't say a word. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved with the grinding, impersonal efficiency of systems that do not care about anyone's feelings. Deborah filed a motion to void the fraudulent transfer, supported by a sworn affidavit detailing the misrepresentation under which I had signed. The county recorder flagged the deed. The DA's office opened a preliminary inquiry. Derek Voigt, it emerged, had done this before. A property transfer 6 years earlier involving an elderly great-aunt of Brenda's, which had been settled quietly and never prosecuted, but which was now very much on record and very much relevant. His real estate license was suspended pending investigation within 3 weeks. The sale to Meridian Holdings was voided before it closed. Brenda hired her own attorney, a man named Torrance, who had the energy of someone who knew his client was guilty and was being paid to manage consequences rather than dispute facts. There were negotiations. There were tense, formal meetings in conference rooms that smelled of carpet cleaner and legal paper. At the end of it, the transfer was reversed. My name was restored to the deed, and Mark signed a separation agreement that was notably less favorable to him than it might have been if he had not been a documented participant in a real estate fraud scheme. He moved into an apartment across town. I learned later from a mutual acquaintance that Brenda had been furious with him for mishandling the plan, as if the problem had been execution rather than ethics, which told me everything I had ever needed to know about Brenda. My father came and helped me change the locks on a Saturday morning in June. We didn't talk much. We worked, side by side, the way we used to work on projects when I was a child, and he was teaching me that the best response to a problem was a specific, practical action. When the last lock was in, he tested the door 3 times, the way engineers check things, and then he handed me the new key, bright, unscratched, clean, and said, "There." Just that. There. It was the most comforting word I had heard in months. The lavender along the front walk bloomed all summer. I cut back the overgrown side garden and planted tomatoes and something called climbing red roses that the woman at the nursery promised would cover the fence by August. And she was right. I had the porch railing repainted, this time by a professional, a warm cream color that Mrs. Calloway said looked like something from a proper magazine. I slept deeply for the first time in years, in a way that told me some low-grade tension I had simply stopped noticing had finally been released. I still have the ceramic sparrow key hook. I moved it from the hall to the kitchen, where I can see it from the table. Some mornings I sit there with my coffee and the specific, quiet morning light that comes through the east window in summer and falls across the floor in long, warm rectangles. And I think about the girl who saved for 11 years and knelt on these floors with a rented sander and built the bookshelf in 47 pieces and never, not once, imagined she would have to fight this hard for what she had built. I think about her with a great deal of tenderness. She was trusting. She was generous. She believed that the people she loved would show her the same. She was wrong about that, but she was right about the house. Some things are worth every fight. Some ground, once you have truly claimed it, cannot be taken from you. Not permanently, not by anyone, not by forged documents or soft-voiced manipulation or a husband who put a $ where his loyalty should have been. The house on Carver Lane is still mine. The lavender still blooms. The 3rd stair still creaks. And every morning I walk down it, I know exactly who I am.